They said she was just the gardener. That's what the new cadets whispered, half curious, half careless, as they passed the quiet figure by the memorial wall. A woman in her late 20s, sleeves rolled up, hands buried in the soil beside rows of lilies planted for names most of them never bothered to read. Sergeant Lane. The plaque read, though to most of them, she was just Ray, the woman who tended flowers where warriors slept. What they didn't know was that she'd once led men twice her age through black water and silence, that her call sign, Ghost, had once carried enough weight to clear frequencies in the dead of night. But here, she was invisible again, and for a time, that suited her fine. If you agree that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off, like and subscribe, because what happens next will remind you. Some vows don't fade. They just wait for the right moment to be called again. The sun was high over Fort Harrington, glinting off the razor wire and bleached stone of the courtyard. The hum of morning drills echoed faintly from the training field, mingling with the rhythmic scrape of a trowel against soil. Ray Lane worked quietly, each movement deliberate. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose braid, her boots half-caked with dust, the kind of messiness that comes from care, not neglect. She had been tending this garden every morning since she transferred back 6 months ago, after her final deployment. No one knew why she'd come back. She'd been offered desk work, even a teaching role in tactical operations, but Ray had turned them all down. "I'll take grounds maintenance," she told the command sergeant. The man had blinked, certain he'd misheard. "You're a SEAL, Lane. You've seen classified combat. Exactly," she'd said, cutting him off. "That's why I need something simple." To the young cadets, she was a mystery. They caught glimpses of her tattoos, coordinates inked near her wrist, a phrase in Latin under her collarbone. Sometimes she smiled when they saluted. Sometimes she didn't. And though they didn't mean disrespect, they spoke of her like she was a relic, someone who'd already lived her story. They were wrong. Hers hadn't even begun to unravel. That morning was like any other, or so it seemed. Ray hummed softly under her breath as she adjusted the angle of a watering can, letting sunlight glint off droplets that sparkled briefly before sinking into the soil. Around her, the air was still. The only movement was the gentle sway of the flag overhead and the faint sound of distant laughter from the mess hall. Then, a flicker of static. The radio on her hip, usually quiet, tuned only to the maintenance channel, crackled to life. A man's voice cut through, flat, strained. "Command to all units. We have an ongoing civilian situation. Multiple hostiles. Possible connection to Sergeant Lane. Repeat, family of Sergeant Lane, taken hostage." The world didn't explode. It shrank. The trowel slipped from her fingers into the dirt. The sound was small, but sharp enough to draw the attention of the cadets across the courtyard. They froze mid-conversation, watching her straighten slowly, her gloved hand trembling just once before she steadied it. The sun, once warm, felt like a spotlight now. Too bright, too harsh. For a second, Ray didn't breathe. She could hear only the pulse in her ears, the echo of those words repeating, twisting into clarity. Family of Sergeant Lane taken hostage. Her brother, his wife, their 6-year-old boy. The air seemed to fold in on itself. She turned toward the open walkway where a group of cadets stood, uncertain, wide-eyed. They didn't know whether to speak or salute. She gave them neither option. "Get me command," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, too calm. "Now." One of them, Cadet Monroe, barely 20, fumbled for his calm "Ma'am, yes, ma'am." His voice cracked, the way boys' voices do when they realize they've just stepped into a moment that won't forget them. Ray removed her gloves with slow precision. Beneath the dirt, her hands bore faint scars, white against tan, thin and deliberate, like tally marks. She hadn't planned to use them again. "Family of Sergeant Lane," she repeated under her breath. The words felt foreign, mechanical. The phrase wasn't just a warning, it was a trigger. And in her world, triggers were never idle. The cadets watched as she knelt again, not to garden this time, but to open the small steel box buried beneath the flower bed. It wasn't on any registry, not logged by base inventory. Inside lay a folded uniform patch, a sealed ID card, and a rusted seal trident she hadn't worn in years. She brushed a speck of dirt off its edge, her eyes catching a faint reflection in the metal. She wasn't supposed to have kept it. She wasn't supposed to keep anything. But Ray Lane had never been good at leaving pieces of herself behind. Behind her, someone whispered, "What's happening?" Another replied softly, "Her family," they said. "Shut up," Monroe hissed, eyes fixed on her. Ray stood again, slipping the trident into her pocket, and looked toward the horizon beyond the perimeter wall. She could almost hear the sea from here, faint and distant, like a memory calling her name. A second radio ping followed, sharper this time. Command requesting response. "Sergeant, do you copy?" She pressed the transmitter to her lips. "Copy." Her voice was steady now, her tone the kind that made even silence obey. "Location? Static." Then coordinates. Northern District. Civilian perimeter. No military presence authorized. "Understood," she said. "Send my authorization code to tactical response. I'm en route." The cadets blinked. "Man, you can't leave base without," one started. Ray turned toward him, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in something deeper. "Son," she said evenly, "I don't wait for permission when blood's on the line." She started walking toward the motor pool, boots crunching against gravel, every step measured. The garden behind her lay half-watered, the lilies catching stray drops from the can she'd left tilted on its side. From the barracks window, someone watched her go. "She doesn't even look scared," a voice murmured. "Because she's not," another answered. "She's remembering." And maybe that was true, because as Ray Lane crossed the threshold of Fort Harrington's gate, something old and dangerous stirred in her. The part of her that had gone dark since that last mission overseas. The one that taught her patience is just a soldier's disguise for waiting. In the command center, officers scrambled over Max and chatter. No one noticed the woman walking past the guard booth, silent, unreadable. No one stopped her, not because she outshrank them, but because they felt that invisible pull that follows certain kinds of people. The ones who've already made peace with what they'll do when it counts. By the time the alert hit the regional channels, Ray Lane was already gone. The last trace of her on the base was a faint line of boot prints leading away from the memorial garden. The cadets lingered there long after, staring at the lilies she'd left half-tended. One of them finally spoke. "She was just the gardener," he said quietly. The others didn't answer, because now they knew she wasn't. She was the storm that comes after silence. And somewhere out there, someone had made the mistake of waking it. By the time the sun slipped behind the tree line, the base had already erupted into quiet chaos. Orders were flying through every channel. Containment, clearance, confirmation. But none of them mentioned Sergeant Ray Lane by name. That was because no one knew where she'd gone. And by the time they figured it out, she was already 3 towns away, driving an unmarked black SUV with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The road curved through the hills like a scar. Her eyes never left it. The radio beside her seat hissed with coded chatter, but her mind wasn't on the noise. It was on the image that had replayed in her head since the call. Her brother's boy, small hands clutching a toy Jeep, the same one she'd sent him after her first deployment. He was 6. 6. Her grip tightened on the wheel until her knuckles went white. "Family of Sergeant Lane taken hostage." The phrase echoed again and again, like the report of a rifle in an empty field. She checked her watch. 37 minutes since the first alert. Too long. The kind of delay that costs blood. Up ahead, the headlights of a tactical convoy flickered through the fog. She recognized the insignia, local response unit, not military. Civilians in uniform. She pressed her foot harder on the gas. The SUV surged forward, cutting the line, gravel spitting from the tires as she pulled in front of them and slammed to a stop. A young officer jumped out, furious. "Hey, you can't." Ray was already out of the car, badge in hand. "Sergeant Lane, Special Operations." He blinked. "Ma'am, this is a hostage zone. We can't authorize." "You're already behind," she said sharply. "Free hostiles. 2 vehicles. You set up your perimeter wrong. They'll hear your comms before you breach. You'll lose them both before you cross the fence line." "How do you?" "Because I taught them." Ray cut in, her tone cold enough to freeze the air. "Now move." The man hesitated, then stepped aside. You didn't argue with that voice. It wasn't arrogance. It was certainty, the kind that only came from seeing how fast things break when you hesitate. Ray pulled her rifle case from the trunk and snapped it open. The weapon inside wasn't new, but it was hers. Custom grip, light trigger, still marked with the faint scratches of saltwater corrosion from a mission that never officially existed. She slid around into the chamber, then exhaled, her breathing steady, her mind narrowing into focus. The world reduced itself to distances, angles, timing. She moved through the brush like a shadow. The house was half a mile ahead, a lonely structure sitting crooked against the slope. 2 guards by the back porch, 1 at the front window. Civilians tied near the interior wall. She could see them through the flickering light. Her brother's silhouette, head bowed, hands bound. Ray crouched low, whispering into her mic, visual confirmed. 3 targets. 2 armed, 1 pacing. No thermal traps. Breach on my mark. But no one answered. Her comm was silent, jammed. They'd cut her feet. She didn't wait. She never had. The next moments unfolded with the same precision that had once earned her the trident. 1 guard down before he hit the deck, the second collapsing into the shadows with a soft grunt. She slipped through the side entrance, her steps soundless on the rotting wood. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and fear. "Don't move," one of the kidnappers barked. He was pacing near the hostages, weapon loose in his grip, his nerves jittering. "You hear me?" I said. Ray stepped out of the dark. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I heard you." The man spun, eyes wide. But he was already too slow. The flash was brief, the silence after longer. The third man barely had time to react before Ray's knee caught his ribs, sending him sprawling. She disarmed him in a motion so fluid it looked rehearsed, because it was. Years of muscle memory compressed into seconds. When the last echo faded, Ray stood in the dim light, her chest rising and falling, her weapon lowered but not forgotten. Her brother looked up from where he sat tied. "Ray." She didn't answer. She was already cutting through the restraints. His wife sobbed once, muffled against her shoulder as Ray steadied her. The boy stared up at her, silent and trembling, too young to understand what kind of storm had just passed through the room. Outside, sirens grew nearer, the convoy finally catching up. But by the time they reached the farmhouse, it was over. Ray Lane stood by the door, weapon slung across her back, her family safe behind her. The lead officer stepped forward, breathless. "What happened here?" Ray looked at him, her face unreadable. "You got here late," she said simply. And with that, she walked past them, into the cooling night, her boots leaving quiet prints in the dirt. No cheers, no debriefs, just silence, the kind she'd learned to live in. Because for Sergeant Ray Lane, battles didn't end with victory. They ended when the people she loved were safe enough for her to start breathing again. By dawn, the horizon was streaked in pale orange, the kind of fragile light that comes only after a long night that almost broke the world. The farmhouse sat quiet now, wrapped in yellow tape and guarded silence. Emergency vehicles idled in the mud, their lights dimmed. The news crews hadn't arrived yet. They wouldn't, not for a while. No one outside command would ever hear what happened here, not the way it really unfolded. Sergeant Ray Lane stood by the back fence, her jacket streaked with dirt and blood, her braid loosened by the wind. Her brother sat on the bumper of an ambulance, a blanket around his shoulders, his wife leaning against him. Their boy, still pale, clutched a juice box he'd been given by a medic. Every few seconds, he looked up, searching for her. And every time he did, Ray forced herself to meet his eyes, to show him she was still there, that the nightmare was over. But it wasn't. Not really. The regional commander arrived an hour later, his boots crunching over the gravel. "Lane," he called, voice low. "Need a word." She didn't turn. "You already have your report," she said. "Yeah," he muttered, stopping beside her. "But not your explanation." Ray's gaze stayed fixed on the line of trees beyond the field. "They wanted leverage," she said. "They thought a SEAL would trade her life for her family's. They were right." He studied her in silence for a long moment. "You disobeyed a direct containment order." "I saved civilians," she replied. He exhaled, tired. "You always did play by your own rules." She turned then, meeting his eyes for the first time. "No," she said quietly. "I just never played by theirs." Behind them, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of her nephew's laughter. The kind of small, hesitant sound that makes all the scars worth something again. Ray closed her eyes briefly. It wasn't relief, not entirely. It was a quiet release, like an anchor being lifted after too long at sea. When she finally walked back to the family, her brother rose immediately. Ray, he began, voice rough. They said you. She shook her head, stopping him. Doesn't matter. You're safe. That's what counts. His wife stepped forward, tears streaking her face. You came for us, she whispered. Ray managed a faint smile. Of course I did. Then, after a pause, softer. I always will. The boy shuffled closer, still gripping his juice box. Aunt Ray, he said timidly. Were you scared? She crouched down so their eyes met. I was, she said honestly. But scared doesn't mean stop. It just means you care enough to keep going. He nodded, small and solemn, as if storing the words somewhere safe. By the time the convoy escorted them home, the sky had turned gold. Ray stayed behind, standing in the quiet field where the chaos had begun. The soil was torn up from boots and tire tracks. She knelt briefly, pressing her palm against the earth. It was still damp, still warm. Goes to command, she said into her radio, voice barely above a whisper. Package secured. Returning to base. Static answered, followed by a familiar voice from HQ. Copy that, Lane. Good work out there. But Ray didn't answer. She'd never cared for praise. Later that morning, she returned to Fort Harrington. The garden still waited, untouched. The lilies she'd left half-watered now leaned toward the light, thirsty and fragile. She pulled her gloves back on, knelt, and began again. Dirt under her nails. Silence in her breath. Behind her, footsteps approached, hesitant, respectful. It was Cadet Monroe. Ma'am, he said quietly. We heard. Command said you neutralized the threat. Ray didn't look up. I finished what started, she said simply. He hesitated. How do you do that? Do what? Stay calm. When it's your family. For a long time, she didn't answer. Then she straightened, brushing soil from her palms. You don't stay calm, she said. You just keep moving until calm catches up. Monroe nodded, unsure whether it was an answer or a warning. We saw you leave yesterday, he admitted. Didn't know what to do. Ray glanced at him, faint amusement in her eyes. Next time you don't know what to do, she said, start by paying attention. The rest comes after. He smiled faintly, embarrassed. Yes, ma'am. Ray returned her gaze to the lilies. One was crushed, its stem bent sideways from where she'd dropped her trowel. Carefully, she lifted it, propped it upright, and pressed the soil around it tighter. Behind her, Monroe lingered. They're saying what you did out there was against protocol, he said quietly. Ray's tone didn't change. Protocol doesn't bleed. He didn't reply. He just stood there a moment longer, watching her tend the garden like nothing had happened, like she hadn't crossed fire and fury less than 12 hours ago. When he finally turned to leave, he realized something. She wasn't tending flowers. She was tending memory. By midday, the sun burned high again. The base returned to its routine. Cadets drilled. Officers shouted. Life moved on. But everyone who passed the memorial garden glanced at the woman kneeling there, the one they used to call the gardener. Now, when they said her name, there was weight in it. Not fear, respect. And though Ray never sought acknowledgement, she could feel the difference in the air, in the way they stood a little straighter, saluted a little sooner. She didn't need medals. She'd buried enough of those already. That evening, when the base lights dimmed and the sky turned copper, she sat alone by the lilies. The breeze carried the scent of rain, distant thunder rolling low. She closed her eyes, listening. For a moment, she thought she could hear waves again, dark, cold, familiar. The ocean had a way of calling its own back eventually. She whispered into the wind, not for anyone to hear. They said I was just the gardener. A faint smile touched her lips. Guess they were half right. Because gardens and families, both required the same thing. Someone willing to protect them when no one else could. And somewhere out there, under that same rising storm, the world was quiet again, not because danger had vanished, but because Sergeant Ray Lane had already answered it.